Hello, this is Vell Baria and welcome to my podcast. Disclaimer, first and foremost, this is unprepared podcast and I would like to apologize if there are sort of errors and stuff that are not so good because I would like to be honest. I sucked at podcast. Yeah, I'm just very honest about this. I am sorry for doing this crazy podcast. First podcast, really, we will screw up. Even our first time of doing something, we screwed up, okay? Lesson learned. So, alright. So, if you guys wanted to tell me why did I do a podcast like this, unrehearsed? Well, you can do podcast scripted for detailed purposes, but in this case, this is my first podcast of all the podcasts. To begin with, I would like y'all to welcome to my podcast first and foremost, and we will begin with the introductory podcast. So we will have 2-part introductory podcasts, and after that we will start with some storytelling like typical podcast people does, sharing some stories, good or bad, maybe motivational, inspirational, whatsoever. And let's begin. For no further ado, if you guys ask me, why did I start this podcast? What's the plan? What's the motivation? And what's the concept? Okay, let's begin with the planning first. It all began in 2020 when our group's counselor told me to make a podcast. And this was the last quarter of 2020. This is the time I met my fiancé, who is now my husband. This is a month before we got married on November 2020, which was still a pandemic. So, I don't know what podcast was until I have to hear a bunch of podcasts on YouTube and thinking about what would be my genre for podcast, okay? So my genre for podcasts would be like more of a motivational speaking. Why? Because today webinars are so hard to do and you would have to organize it earlier. Instead, you have a week long to plan all the topics that you would like to share, specific topics. And also, it's not just motivational. It is also about appreciating people, appreciating places, and of course, I will treat this podcast as a audio diary because not all can read. Okay? Not everybody can read and not everybody can hear. So I would like to do it like options. I will try my best to make a transcript of what I'm saying. So please be patient. Alright, so I'm done sharing my planning, the plans, why, when it happened, where it happened, and also the concept. Let me go back to the concept. So the concept of my podcast is not only inspirational or storytelling, but also maybe we could come up with any suggestions. You can put down your suggestions in the comments if you wish to. Maybe I'll put up with how's life going on and challenges, triumphs, struggles. Maybe, I don't know, but let me imagine, like imagination. Let me go back to the concept again. Sorry for being repetitive. Alright, this podcast, I will try to be raw and transparent. I can make mistakes accidentally, okay? Because nobody's even perfect in this world, okay? Even us, we try our best, but we don't strive for perfection, but we strive for motivation to keep ourselves better. Okay? And of course, this podcast is really, both like traditional and informational. At the same time, I will try my best to make a well-detailed podcast if I really, 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 really need to. And lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of fun. Oh, if you guys ask me, are you going to do a collaboration for podcast? Of course. Of course. I'm open to collaborations and stuff as long as we can plan it earlier, because we do have different schedules and we cannot just let you in according to, unplanned circumstances. So we gotta plan things carefully. I understand we can go on with the flow, my bad. But we gotta be careful, be considerate also with other people's situation. Okay? So, if you guys ask me, Vell, why are you doing a podcast instead of doing webinars? Like I said, webinars are hard to plan because of how many people will attend. This is another thing I'm telling you. Webinars are literally a challenging thing to do because you would have to find a collaborative sponsor. Okay? This is for pre-pandemic or in-person, seminars. Webinars, on the other hand, you need to have a stable internet connection. I am sorry to forget this. This another reason. Internet connection is really critical. If you want to do a webinar, you need to make yourself fixed and prepared. Don't do it unprepared. A podcast, you can erase something you don't like to include. But webinar, technical difficulties, I understand, it happens. Well, like I said, it happens, like mishaps happens all the time. You can't control the mishaps. For me, this podcast, I hope this helps, and this will, go further and further and further. And I love to experiment a variety. This is a variety for me if this podcast will work. Because like I said, podcast is already a trend. And of course, I would like to make this podcast a valuable podcast, not just for the sake, like podcast is just a boring podcast. Of course, we love to be more realistic. At the same time, we like to have a value, have to make a podcast that is valuable to learn and worth the repeat if able. So it's just like composing a song. You want your listeners to repeat your song 10 to 100 times, maybe 1,000 times, right? So this podcast, of course, we want to make sure that it's not just worth the viewership or the listening count. Yeah, but we want to make sure that we are catering a lot of people and be proud. Even though it's just a few number of views, what matters is you are able to have a handful of valuable viewers and supporters, We will build audience. That was also the other goal for podcast. Building an audience, a demographic of audience. Of course, this podcast audience is for everybody. If you have, it's not just about autistic people, okay? Everybody in general. Let's be open to anyone who love to, who would love to listen to the podcast. the doors are open to hear the podcast that I am going to make. Of course, let's make ourselves, prepared in the upcoming podcasts. Maybe 2 topics per day, or maybe per week, per month. It depends. So for no further ado, I came up with a title, and it would be Vellypoo's Podcast. So this is the official title, Vellypoo's Podcast. Alright, so we came up with a title, and let's enjoy the podcast making, as long as it comes from the heart and it also has a value, and of course worth the repeat and worth the sharing. Yes, this is something we don't expect, but it is done by some of your audience members. Okay? This has to be done by the audience members who are so interested to share this, not just listening to it, okay? And wow, this is first of many. The Vellypoo's Podcast is now officially started. Up for the next part of the podcast, this is Vell Baria, now signing off until our next podcast.